You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Just before Thanksgiving in November of 1987, 37-year-old Beth Sternlieb stopped to steady herself against a water fountain in a hospital hallway. A slim, strong woman with a bob of blonde hair, she was due to give birth to her second son very soon. The surges of pain were excruciating and growing stronger. Beth's husband, Greg, helped her shuffle along the corridor, trying to distract her in conversation. But the spasms she was experiencing were too intense to ignore. Beth's career as a yoga and meditation teacher at the nearby University of California at Los Angeles had taught her lots of strategies for coping with pain. But childbirth was testing her limits. Greg stroked Beth's hand and suggested she picture a perfect day with their whole family at a beautiful beach in Malibu or maybe a scenic hike in the hills. Beth relaxed a little while visualizing each scene until one powerful contraction scrambled her thoughts. It was so strong, she knew it could only mean one thing. Before she even realized what was happening, Beth was being eased into a wheelchair as Greg and a nurse rushed her down the hall. Everything was a blur of fluorescent lights and gleaming hallway floors until they were pushing through swinging doors into a delivery room. Hours later, drenched in sweat and her muscles aching from furious pushing, Beth suddenly heard the most magical sound, her baby crying. When the doctor finally placed the bundled-up tiny pink infant onto her chest, Beth gazed down at his sweet little face and smiled. All the pain and all the effort had been worth it, and now she was just looking forward to getting some rest. But a couple of weeks later, as Beth slumped in a chair in her doctor's office, she somehow felt even worse than right after delivering her baby. After the birth of her first child a few years ago, Beth had experienced typical postpartum aches and pains, but this time was different. Her primary physician, Dr. Shay Mitchell, listened intently as Beth told him what was going on. For a few days now, her head had throbbed with a dull, deep pain, her muscles ached, and her bowels had been churning. Her entire biological system felt under attack from top to bottom. No matter how many naps she took or how healthy a diet she ate, Beth felt wrecked. Dr. Mitchell nodded as Beth described what she'd been going through. Afterwards, he reviewed her medical chart and the vitals his nurse had taken when Beth first arrived. Then he took a seat on a stool facing Beth and told her not to worry too much. Her recovery from the pregnancy was actually proceeding at a healthy rate. However, he said that, this winter had been one of the worst flu seasons in Los Angeles that Dr. Mitchell had ever seen. So more than likely, Beth had just caught a bug that was a bit more stubborn than usual. And so he advised her to rest as much as she could and to drink lots of fluids. This was traditional advice, but hydration and rest would boost her body's strength to fight off whatever infection was causing her symptoms. If she stuck to this regimen for a while, Dr. Mitchell felt sure that Beth would soon be on the mend. Back at home, Beth told her husband that according to Dr. Mitchell, she very likely had the flu. Greg thought that made sense and offered to cover as much extra childcare as necessary to help his wife get back on her feet. Later that day, once the baby was down for a nap, Greg took their toddler out for a walk in the winter sun, while Beth retreated to the bedroom, closed the curtains, and crawled under the covers. When she woke up a couple of hours later to the sound of Greg and their toddler laughing in the front yard, she already felt better. Beth felt confident that her body would find its way back to health. It just needed time. But one afternoon, 6 months later, after a long shift at the UCLA Meditation Center, Beth felt unusually drained and went to rest in her office. Her postpartum flu-like sickness was long gone, but she'd been feeling run down the past couple of days. Around mid-morning, a headache had crept in and never left. By mid-afternoon, her body felt sore and limp, and she couldn't focus. Sitting in her office chair, Beth rested her head on the desk and rubbed her stomach, trying her best to ease the pain in her gut. As she did, she lifted her shirt and noticed something. A scattering of tiny dots all over her torso. Fortunately, they didn't itch or sting, but they were odd and new, which worried her. Later that night, Beth checked her stomach again before getting into the shower. And to her shock, the dots had multiplied and spread. Now her entire stomach was a solid block of red, like a really bad sunburn. Beth decided it was definitely time to make another appointment with Dr. Mitchell. A few days later, on a hot summer morning, Greg took the morning off of work to watch the baby while Beth went to the clinic. She felt woozy and bleached out by the sun as she crossed the parking lot and marched up the front steps into the building. Once inside of Dr. Mitchell's office, Beth raised her shirt to show him the thick red splotch across her stomach. And under the fluorescent lights, they looked even more severe. Dr. Mitchell studied the rash's texture and traced the tendrils to where it had spread the farthest. After a few moments, he stood back and shook his head. He admitted that he wasn't sure what it was, but his guess was some type of hives, which are usually caused by an allergic reaction. Beth didn't have any specific allergies that she knew of, but Dr. Mitchell told her that allergies can start any time in a person's life, for all sorts of reasons. Dr. Mitchell also said it was possible that Beth might have an autoimmune disease like psoriasis, which can cause severe rashes. He explained that autoimmune diseases are basically like the body having an allergic reaction to itself. Dr. Mitchell wrote down the name and number of a colleague who specialized in autoimmune disorders and gave it to Beth. If anybody could find out what was going on with her skin, it would be him. But unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Early the next week, Beth made an appointment with the doctor, had blood drawn for multiple tests, then waited several days for a response. But when the call finally came, the doctor had disappointing news. All the tests were inconclusive. He told Beth that her results suggested the presence of some sort of autoimmune disorder, but there was not enough data to determine anything more specific. Beth felt frustrated and tired of this runaround with her health, but the red rash on her stomach had faded, along with the rest of her symptoms. So Beth shrugged it off and refocused on her work and family. Her baby and toddler were growing up quickly, and she wanted to savor every day of it. One spring morning, about 4 years later, Beth's bedroom door burst open as both her kids tumbled onto the bed, hungry for breakfast. Her oldest was in elementary school, and her youngest was almost in kindergarten. Greg play wrestled with both of them as Beth slipped out of bed and went into the kitchen to start the coffee. But as she did, she noticed her head felt hazy. Last night, Greg had arranged a dinner party to celebrate Beth's return from a work trip, so they had stayed up late drinking wine and socializing. Now she felt like she was paying for it. As the coffee brewed, Beth rubbed her temples and pictured the long, busy workday ahead of her. Her kids seemed to have more energy every day, so juggling motherhood with a full-time job was not getting any easier, and having a slight hangover made it even worse. After feeding the kids breakfast, Beth got dressed and went to the bathroom to freshen up. Standing in front of the mirror, something familiar caught her eye. A rash of tiny red dots across her stomach. Beth's heart sank. The rash and the accompanying sickness came back a few times every year. But it had been about 6 months since the last time, so Beth had hoped that this time it might be gone for good. Later that morning, Beth was in the middle of a meditation class when her stomach lurched. She told her students to continue without her, and then she rushed to the bathroom. That day, all her familiar symptoms returned: the headache, the muscular pains, and the cramps. As she drove home through rush hour traffic after work, Beth felt overwhelmed and defeated. All her life, she had considered herself blessed to be a naturally healthy person. But something had changed after her second pregnancy. She still didn't understand what it was, but it was clear that this sickness, whatever it was, wasn't going away anytime soon. That night after dinner, Beth discussed the situation with Greg. She admitted that she had been feeling spread thin lately. The kids required so much energy, and her work had been tougher this semester. But, even so, Beth was confused how stress alone could be responsible for her recurring symptoms. Feeling generally run down was totally normal for any working parent, but pounding headaches and diarrhea and mysterious rashes were not. While Greg washed the dishes, Beth went to their bedroom to meditate. Sitting in the lotus position on her yoga mat with candles lit, Beth tried to block out stressful thoughts. She focused on breathing evenly, letting her body settle into a sense of calm. But worries kept nagging her, that these symptoms would keep coming back forever, and they would get worse as she got older, and maybe one day she'd be too weak and tired to fight them off. Beth gave up on meditation, opened her eyes, blew out the candles, and climbed into bed. Greg came in later and sat next to her. He suggested that Beth call in sick tomorrow and spend the day looking for new doctors. There had to be some medical professional out there who could figure out what was going on with her. Beth was grateful to have such a supportive partner and agreed to Greg's suggestion. But the next day started a trend that would go on for years. Calling various clinics, talking to all sorts of doctors, taking tests, and waiting for results. Yet nobody was able to determine what was causing her symptoms, so her symptoms just kept on returning. Every 5 or 6 months, the illness would return and knock Beth out for a week and then subside. Gradually, Beth learned to coexist with it. She had no other choice. Then came the summer of 2005. One hot day in late August of that year, Beth crouched in the living room surrounded by boxes, helping her son finish packing for college. It felt joyous and surreal, but also sad. Her youngest was now 18 and leaving the next morning to move into his freshman dorm. Beth had intended to go with him and help him get settled, but she'd woken up with an intense fever a few days ago and still felt too weak to make the drive. Her rash had also returned, this time worse than ever, covering her entire torso and up her neck. But it was the fever that really worried her. It had spiked a few times at 104. Beth tossed and turned through the nights, drenched in sweat. During the days, she felt too sick and exhausted to eat and fought to keep her eyes open. She had not been to work even once this week. Beth did visit her most recent doctor, who ran some tests and discovered that her white blood cell count was high, proving she had an infection of some sort. But, as always, he still had no answers as to what was making her sick. Once the boxes were all packed and taped, her son left to go meet up with some friends, and as soon as the door closed, Beth felt her body shut down. She always tried to put on a brave face in front of her kids, but inside, she was losing it. Beth had been battling this sickness for 18 long years. No matter how much she took care of herself or how proactive she was about seeing doctors, nothing had improved. Every 6 months, it came back like clockwork, and now it had returned with a vengeance. Her husband tried to stay optimistic, but she could tell he was beaten down by this too. This was not the life they had imagined together years ago when they started a family. Beth went to the bedroom, drew the blinds, and buried herself in the covers. She tried once again to rest and unwind, but she was getting tired of pretending that things would change. At the back of her mind lurked a dark thought. Was she doomed to live like this forever? 5 months later, Beth was lying on her back in a hospital room, waiting to be slid inside the big white donut of a CT scan machine. The past few months had been Beth's worst yet. Her fatigue had intensified to the point that she had to arrange an indefinite leave of absence from work. Beth's job was her passion, and without it, she fell into a depression, spending entire days in bed or on the couch. She barely ate or left the house. Over a couple of months of this gloomy routine, Beth lost 15 pounds, which only made her weaker. But, despite all this, Beth was still a fighter. She hadn't given up hope of finding someone who could help. Her latest doctor, Dr. William Bruce, specialized in infectious diseases, and over the past month, he tested Beth for a number of possible causes for her sickness, including malaria, parasitic infections, autoimmune diseases, and even HIV and hepatitis. One by one, they were all ruled out. So now, Dr. Bruce had ordered a CT scan to see if Beth might have some sort of internal injury or intrusive growth. Once the CT scan machine was prepared, a nurse slid Beth into the center cavity and then left the room. Beth lay there and listened to the mechanical hum, letting her mind wander. She had been through too much at this point to let her hopes rise very high, but a part of her stayed optimistic. About 15 minutes later, the machine powered down and the nurse returned and wheeled Beth out. A few minutes after that, Dr. Bruce entered and told Beth he would call her with the results as soon as they were ready, most likely in a day or two. The next 48 hours seemed to crawl by until finally, early one afternoon, while Beth sat on the couch under a blanket, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Her CT scan results had come in. Beth listened tensely as a nurse explained that the doctor had discovered 8 fibroids in her uterus. Now, by itself, that was not so shocking. Small uterine fibroids are common in women over 40, and they're very rarely cancerous. But one of Beth's fibroids was abnormally large, which could spell trouble. fibroids tend to swell when they lose their blood supply and begin to die, which can lead to complications. The hospital gave Beth the phone number of a gynecologist, Dr. Jessica Schneider. They recommended that she call Dr. Schneider first thing in the morning to treat the issue. Beth promised she would, hung up, and went to tell her husband. Beth wasn't sure what to make of all this news yet, but she couldn't help but feel optimistic about the discovery. Was this really it? Was this the source of 18 years of sickness? Later that week, Dr. Jessica Schneider sat across from Beth in her office and told her she would need surgery. Beth nodded slowly with a look of resignation, like she'd somehow been expecting this. This was Dr. Schneider's third consultation with Beth. Over the course of their meetings, she had grown fond of her patient. Despite Beth's soft-spoken manner, she was clearly tough and resilient. Even so, this illness had obviously taken a toll. Beth's warm smile looked tired, and her eyes were ringed with dark circles. Dr. Schneider didn't want to add to Beth's struggles, but she knew surgery was a must. Over her years as a gynecologist, she had encountered fibroids many times and knew what to watch out for. When fibroids die, they often get big very quickly, and there was always a chance that any of Beth's fibroids could be cancerous. Dr. Schneider booked Beth's surgery for a couple weeks away in December and warned Beth that it was possible the fibroids were not the cause of all her sickness. If so, the surgery wouldn't change anything, but it was worth a shot. After the surgery, once Beth was stitched up and wheeled out of the operating room, Dr. Schneider scooted her stool in front of a stainless steel surgical tray and looked down upon the largest fibroid she had ever seen in her career. It was about the size of a grapefruit, 4 inches across. Dr. Schneider shook her head in shock as she thought of Beth carrying that enormous thing around inside of her. Poking it with her surgical ruler, Dr. Schneider was surprised by the fibroid's consistency. Normally, fibroids are dense, like little balls of muscle. This one was strangely springy and swollen. Dr. Schneider picked up a scalpel from her surgeon's toolkit and gently pressed the blade into the flesh of the fibroid. As soon as the tip pierced the skin, white pus exploded onto her hand. Slicing deeper, Dr. Schneider could not believe what she was seeing. The fibroid was like a rotten dumpling, filled to the brim with infected liquid. In all her years of study and practice, Dr. Schneider had never seen or heard of a fibroid like this. She quickly placed it in a sterile container and then hurried to have it tested by the lab. Dr. Schneider didn't know for sure, but every medical instinct in her body pointed the same direction. Whatever it was in this giant fibroid had to be the thing that had been making Beth sick. Days later, Dr. Schneider's phone rang with the report she had been waiting for, and with it, the explanation for Beth's long illness. Beth's fibroid was not cancerous, but it had been incredibly bad for her. The pus inside of Beth's fibroid was absolutely teeming with an unidentified strain of Salmonella bacteria. And, as far as the lab could tell, this Salmonella had been festering inside of Beth for a long time. Possibly as far back as 1987, when Beth gave birth to her second child. For 18 years, Beth had been suffering from a simmering Salmonella infection that sometimes boiled over and caused her terrible cramps, rashes, and all the other debilitating symptoms. With the source of the infection removed, Beth's body could finally recover. Now, only one final question remained. How had she contracted the bacteria? Several months later, Beth was at home when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a public health nurse bearing unusual news. The hospital had kept testing the Salmonella from Beth's fibroid, searching for a match, until they finally found one. Hers was not the Salmonella commonly found in contaminated or undercooked food, but instead was a Salmonella strain only found in reptiles. Beth was blown away. Her kids had never once owned a pet reptile, and as far as she knew, there had never been a reptile in their house before. She had no idea how anyone in her family would have even been around one. Though Beth never got an official explanation for how she caught this reptilian strain of Salmonella, her doctors suspected that she contracted it while in the hospital for the birth of her second child. All it would have taken is one employee or patient with a pet turtle or frog or lizard who didn't properly wash their hands to touch something that Beth later touched as well: a doorknob, a railing, a water fountain. After that, the disease took shelter in a uterine fibroid where it would periodically escape into her bloodstream, causing her repeated bouts of illness. After her surgery, Beth never suffered from another episode of her terrible rash or other symptoms ever again. She returned to teaching mindfulness and yoga full-time with a deeper appreciation for health than ever before. On February 12, 1999, 42 Carol Sund, along with her 15-year-old daughter Julie and Julie's longtime friend Silvina Peloso, who was 16 years old, boarded a plane in Eureka, California. After a quick 1-hour-long flight, they landed in San Francisco and then got their bags from baggage claim and then walked over to the airport's car rental center. After Carol signed some rental agreement paperwork with the person at the front desk, they were given car keys, and then the three women walked out of the airport into the parking lot where they saw their car. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix sedan. After the women had put their luggage in the trunk, they all climbed inside, and then Carol began driving east towards the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Julie was competing in a cheerleading competition the following day at that university, and Julie was considering going to the school after she graduated high school, and so this cheerleading competition was a great excuse for her and her mom to check out the campus, and since Silvina was already visiting Julie at her home in Eureka, she just tagged along for the trip. After an hour-and-a-half long drive, the trio arrived in Stockton, California, and they checked into a hotel, and then the next day, which was the 13th, Julie competed in this cheerleading competition, and then afterwards, her mom, and Silvina spent the rest of the day checking out the campus and the surrounding town. Early the next morning, which was the 14th, the women checked out of their hotel and then drove 3 hours southeast to the sprawling motel complex called Cedar Lodge that was located just outside of Yosemite National Park's western entrance. Their plan was to spend a couple of days sightseeing inside of Yosemite before heading back to the San Francisco airport, where they were going to meet Carol's husband and Julie's father, Jens, and then the four of them would continue their journey and fly to Arizona, where they would explore the Grand Canyon before finally heading back home to Eureka, California. So midday on the 14th, these three women arrive at the Cedar Lodge, and the lot would have been nearly empty because it was the wintertime and not that many people were visiting the park at that time. So they pull into the lot, they park their car, they go into the front desk where they checked in and they got their keys, and then they left the office and walked along the row of first floor rooms all the way to the very corner of the building to room 509, which was their room. Carol used her key, she opened the door, they went inside and dropped their luggage, and then they decided that they were just too tired to actually go in the park and go sightseeing that day, so instead they kind of had a low-key afternoon and evening mostly in their hotel room. The next morning, which was the 15th, the women got up early, they hopped in their red rental car, and they drove to the western entrance of Yosemite. They went inside, they parked their car, and they have this wonderful day looking at these astonishing cliff sides and snow-covered mountains and these huge sequoia trees and these beautiful meadows that stretched out in front of them. And then towards the end of the day, Julie and Silvina actually went ice skating on a frozen pond. So it was just this totally magical day at the park. And then finally, as the sun was starting to go down, the trio finally left the park, got in their rental car, and drove back to the Cedar Lodge. There, they ate dinner at the lodge's 1950s style diner. They ate hamburgers, and then afterwards they swung by the front desk and rented some VHS movie tapes that they brought back to their room. Once they were inside room 509, the women changed into their pajamas and then sat on the bed and watched one of their movies, and then when it was over, they brushed their teeth and then they got in bed, turned out the light, and tried to go to sleep. But a few minutes after their lights were out, they heard a knock on their door. The following day, which was the 16th, Jens, Carol's husband and Julie's father, was anxiously waiting at the San Francisco airport for his wife and his daughter and his daughter's friend. And he's looking at his watch and he knows they don't have that much time before their flight is going to take off, and he's just hoping they're going to come running around a corner and they're going to barely make this flight. But they don't. And finally, Jens, who does not have a cell phone, and neither does Carol, he decides there must have been some sort of miscommunication and that Carol and the girls must have flown on ahead. And so he decides at the last minute to just board the flight himself and fly to Arizona in hopes his family will be there. But when he touches down in Arizona, his family is not there. And so he rushed to the hotel hoping that maybe they were there. They weren't. He spoke to the hotel's front desk and said, hey, has my wife Carol contacted you? And they said, no, she hasn't contacted us and we have no record of her being here. And so Jens is obviously very upset. He's very worried, and he spends the rest of the day calling around to friends and family and acquaintances and anybody who might know where Carol and the girls are. But nobody has heard from them and nobody knows where they are. And so that night, as Jens is about to go to bed, he convinces himself that they are probably just fine. This is just some screw up. Carol is an unbelievably fierce woman. She's incredibly competent. She will take care of those girls, and I'm sure I will see them tomorrow morning. But when he woke up the next morning and Carol had not made any contact with the hotel or reached out to him in any way, and there was just no sign of her or the girls, Jens finally contacted police. That day, after the police spoke with Jens, the first call they made was to the Cedar Lodge, which is the last place they knew Carol, Julie, and Sylvina had been. The manager of the lodge would tell police that he had not seen Carol or the girls on the day they were supposed to check out, which was the 16th. But Carol had checked out in advance, so the manager would not have seen her anyways. She would not have had to go by the front desk on the way out. So that was not an anomaly. The manager also told police that on the 16th, after the three women should have been out of their room, the cleaners went by room 509, and when they went inside, it was vacant and nothing seemed amiss. It was relatively clean, minus some wet towels that had been left on the floor of the bathroom. The keys to the room were left on the desk as they should be. It just looked like the women had left. And so the police reached out to the car rental company at the San Francisco airport to see if Carol had made it to the airport and dropped off her car. But when they spoke to the manager of this rental company, they would say, no, Carol has not dropped off her car and she hasn't called about extending her lease, which is now overdue. Based on the information the police gathered from the lodge and from the rental car company, they began operating on the theory that the three women left their lodge motel room on the 16th and then either got into a car accident somewhere and had just not been found yet, or they had driven somewhere, gotten out of their car and gotten lost, perhaps inside of Yosemite National Park or some other trail somewhere, or they had fallen victim to some crime. But at this point, the police were not taking seriously the idea that foul play was involved. A massive search was launched in and around the Cedar Lodge complex, as well as around the western entrance of Yosemite, but absolutely nothing was found. A number of workers from Cedar Lodge were interviewed by police and subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. Also, a number of friends and family of the three women were also interviewed by police and cleared as well. Then, a few days after this search has started, there was a break in the case. Carol's wallet, with her ID and credit cards inside of it, was found lying on the ground in Modesto, California, which was a suburb that was located about 2 hours west of Cedar Lodge. Some high school students saw it on the ground and gave it to a police officer. There was no reason for Carol and the girls to be in Modesto, California, and so this signaled to police that a third party had to have been involved in their disappearance. And so if that was the case, then almost certainly these three women had fallen victim to some sort of crime. Over the next several weeks, police continued to search the roads and trails in and around Cedar Lodge and the western entrance to Yosemite, and they looked all over Modesto. But besides this wallet being found, there were no further developments with the case. Then on March 18th, which is about a month after the three women originally went missing, a hiker was way off in the middle of this forest about 2 hours north of Cedar Lodge and about an hour and a half northeast of Modesto, California, when he turned onto this logging road that nobody really ever went down. And as he's walking down this road, he sees up ahead the skeleton of a car. It looks like a car had been set on fire. And so he calls it into police, not really knowing what he's looking at. The police come out and they're able to identify this car. This shell of a car is the red rental car that Carol and the girls had been using. When they searched the car, the inside, the main cabin of the car, there really was nothing left. There looked to be some remnants of some suitcases and maybe some clothing, but mostly it was just the frame of the car and some springs. But when they opened the trunk of the car, they made a grisly discovery. Inside were two very badly burned bodies with their hands still bound behind their backs. Using dental records, they were able to confirm the bodies belonged to Carol and Sylvina. But there was no sign of Carol's daughter, Julie, the 15-year-old. She was not in the car, around the car, or in the surrounding areas. And so there was this glimmer of hope that maybe if law enforcement acts fast enough, they can find Julie and save her before it's too late. But all hope was lost when just a couple of days into this search around the car, when they still hadn't found anything, the police received an anonymous handwritten letter. And on this letter was this crude map that showed this very specific spot overlooking a lake. It was Don Pedro Lake, which was located about an hour to the south of where the car was. And then on this note as well was a phrase. It just said, "We had fun with this one." Using this crude map, the police went to Don Pedro Lake. They went up to the overlook as marked on this map, and there they looked down and they saw the crumpled and badly decomposed remains of Julie. At this point, police already had several suspects they had picked up in Modesto, California, that they believed were connected in some way to what happened to these three women. Of these suspects, two were of particular interest to the police. They were half-brothers Eugene Dykes and Michael Lorwick. They had been arrested shortly after Carol's wallet had been found for shooting at a Modesto police officer and for several drug charges and for violating their parole. Once these half-brothers were in custody, Eugene made several self-incriminating remarks, basically insinuating that he and Michael had been involved in what happened to these three women. And then after Carol, Sylvina, and Julie's bodies had been found, the synthetic fibers that were found all over Carol matched the synthetic fibers that were pulled off of Michael and Eugene on their clothing and from their vehicle when they were arrested. And so the police were very confident that they had their killers and they had them behind bars already. But they still needed to compile evidence before they could formally charge them and make their names public to the media. And so when the news broke about the women's bodies being found and the public began panicking about a killer or killers on the loose, the police came out and said, "Everybody calm down. We have the people responsible. We just can't tell you who they are yet. You need to be patient. We're building the case, but everybody's safe. There's nothing to worry about." But 4 months went by and the police still had not come out and publicly charged anyone with these murders. But they continued to assure the public that they had their killers behind bars, and so nobody has anything to worry about. On the afternoon of July 22nd, roughly 4 months after the discovery of the three bodies, Dr. Desmond Kidd, who was the medical director for Yosemite, had just finished a long 24-hour shift in the clinic, and he had just gotten back to his cabin, which was inside of Yosemite, when his pager went off. And so he went to a phone, he dialed the number that was on his pager, and the park dispatcher picked up and said, "Hey, Dr. Kidd, can you be a part of a search for a missing person?" And Dr. Kidd said, "Sure, I'd love to help." And then there was a pause, and the park dispatcher said, "Hey, just so you know, there are law enforcement implications with this one." And then before he could clarify, he hung up the phone. And so Dr. Kidd is really confused what he meant about these implications, because in the past 3 years he had worked at this park, he had unfortunately been involved in many searches for missing people in the park, but they were never tied to any sort of criminal activity. They were always because the person got lost or fell or something, which was fairly common inside of the park. And so as soon as this convoy of other Yosemite staff members that are part of the search rolled up in front of his cabin, Dr. Kidd ran outside, he hopped in one of the vehicles, and he asked the driver, what's going on? What are these law enforcement implications with regards to this missing person? And the driver would explain to him that, hey, 4 months earlier, we had those 3 Yosemite tourists go missing, Carol, Julie, and Sylvina, and they were found murdered outside of Yosemite. And while the police have said they have their killers behind bars, the police still have not come out and actually named who their killers are or charged anyone in their murders. And so that's made many of us think that maybe they don't have the killer or killers behind bars. Maybe there's a killer or killers still on the loose. And unfortunately, tonight, we have another person who's gone missing inside of the park. And she's gone missing under very mysterious circumstances, which has led many of us to think that it's possible, if there really is a killer out there, they've struck again tonight. Dr. Kidd was totally shocked at this news, but he was even more shocked when he discovered who it was that was missing. It was somebody he knew. Her name was Joey Armstrong, and she was a 26-year-old naturalist employed by Yosemite. A naturalist is like an expert tour guide that knows everything about the park. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the convoy of Yosemite staff that were going to be a part of the search sped around the corner and went down this unmarked road with huge trees on either side, and then eventually they came out of this heavily heavily forested road, and they entered into this unbelievably beautiful meadow. And on the very far end, across this huge meadow, is this one green cabin sitting at the base of this mountain with a forest on the other side of it. This totally secluded cabin in the middle of Yosemite was where Joey was living. As Dr. Kidd and the convoy went across this meadow and got closer to this cabin, Dr. Kidd could see park rangers walking around the perimeter of the cabin, marking it off with yellow police tape. When Dr. Kidd and his vehicle came to a stop right outside of the marked off area, they got out and they could see parked right next to the cabin was this white pickup truck. It was Joey's pickup truck, and inside of it was a bunch of luggage, and it looked like there was luggage that had spilled out onto the ground, and some of the doors were still open. And so it gave Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers the impression that Joey must have either been loading things into her truck or unloading things out of her truck at the time she went missing. Dr. Kidd and the rest of the searchers kind of huddled up with the park rangers, and the rangers explained that Joey's friends that were living in San Francisco were expecting Joey to arrive at their house the day before, but when she didn't and they couldn't get in touch with her, they had called it in, and that's why they were there looking for her. And so after talking about the circumstances of the case, they all decided they would break into 5 different search groups, and they would begin searching the immediate area. Dr. Kidd and 4 other searchers began walking behind the cabin towards the tree line, and then once they got into that forest, they started walking towards this creek. And as they walked up along this creek, they suddenly noticed a whole bunch of trampled ferns and saplings, and it looked like someone had come running through there, and perhaps the person who was running was Joey. And so they began following these tracks that go right alongside this creek, and then at some point, one of the searchers yells out, "Hey, what's that up there?" And about 10 feet ahead of them, where the ground kind of sloped down into a ditch out of view, right before the ditch, hanging on a little tree on the ground, was a set of car keys glinting in the sunlight. And so Dr. Kidd, who was at the front of his small search party, he began walking towards these keys, and as he got closer and closer, he began to be able to see down into this ditch right on the other side of these keys. And as soon as he could actually see what was at the bottom, he immediately began to gag, and he turned around and quickly walked away. The other 4 searchers, they walked up and they had a look down, and they too had a similar reaction. And before long, the group was running back to the cabin to tell the park rangers what they had just discovered. When the rangers heard about what was in the forest, they immediately contacted the police, and the police sent a police officer to Joey Armstrong's mother's house, which was just outside of San Francisco. When the mother opened the door, the officer told her that they had just gotten a call from Yosemite and they need her to call them. And then he handed her a piece of paper with a phone number on it. Joey's mother was immediately concerned and confused and tried to get more information from this officer, but the officer just said, "Look, you're just going to have to call that phone number. I really don't know anything." And so eventually she thanked him, she shut the door, and she went into the kitchen and she dials this number. After someone picked up, she introduced herself as Joey's mother, and at that point, the person who picked up quickly handed the phone off to someone who sounded much more senior, and this person asked Joey's mother, "Are you aware that your daughter is missing?" So Joey's mother says, "No, I was not aware of that." And then this person very delicately says, "Ma'am, we believe we found your daughter's body near her cabin." Joey's mother's reaction was instant. She said, "Well, did you check her hair? She has red hair. Can you confirm it's really her? Because she's got bright red hair. Can you make sure it's really her?" And the person on the other side of the line hesitated for a minute and then just said, "Ma'am, we're not sure if she has red hair or not. We'll get back to you." And so after this call finally ended, Joey's mother was confused. How could they not know what color her daughter's hair was? That seems like such an easy way to potentially identify whether or not this was really her daughter. Why would they make her wait for something like that? And so she was horribly distraught. She didn't know what else to do. She was told to just kind of wait for more news, but she couldn't do that. And so she began planning a trip out to Yosemite to actually get out there and see what was going on. But the earliest flight she could possibly get was not until very early the next morning. And so she has this very restless night's sleep where she's just praying that this person was not actually her daughter. And then the next morning she gets up, she rushes to the airport, and as she's waiting to board her plane, she grabs a newspaper from a nearby kiosk, and the headline reads, "Naturalist Beheaded at Yosemite." And that's when she understood why that person could not tell her whether or not this was her daughter based on hair color. It's because this body did not have a head. But from the time she got that phone call to this headline running in the paper, these searchers had found the head. It was located 27 feet away under some brush, and they were able to confirm confirm that it was the body of Joey Armstrong. Joey's death was immediately treated like a homicide, and right away, the public began to openly suggest that maybe Joey's murder is connected to the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina from 4 months earlier, even though the police were still saying, we have our killers behind bars for those murders. Joey's murder is completely unconnected. Luckily, the public and the police did not have to argue for very long about who was right about this, because there was a break in Joey's case almost immediately. On the night that Joey went missing, another Yosemite staff member had happened to drive by her cabin, and they noticed a distinctive SUV parked outside of her cabin that they didn't recognize. It was a blue 1979 International Scout, and as it happened, there were only 2 of these particular types of vehicles registered in Yosemite Valley. And so within 24 hours, the police had tracked down one of these 2 vehicles. It was located about 12 miles away from the western entrance of Yosemite and was pulled off the side of this highway. The police pulled up alongside it and parked. They walked up. There was no one inside of this vehicle, but then down this embankment off the highway led down to this forest where there was a river kind of out of sight that people like to swim and fish in. And so these 2 officers decide to head down and see if maybe the driver is down there. So they make their way down, and sure enough, they come in contact with the driver. He was laying on this rock, completely nude, smoking marijuana. And so the 2 officers, they come up to him and announce themselves, and this very well-built, good-looking guy stands up and he calmly covers himself, and he takes the marijuana out of his mouth and he says, hey, what can I do for you guys? And so over the course of their conversation, the police would learn this guy's name was Kerry Stainer. He was 38 years old, and he was the handyman at Cedar Lodge Motel. He would tell police that he was not anywhere near Joey's cabin on the night she went missing, and the police ultimately bought it and said, okay, they confiscated his marijuana, and then they walked back up the hill, leaving him down there, and they took some pictures of his car and the tires on his car, and then they left. A couple of days later, some FBI investigators that had been called in for this case, they analyzed those pictures those officers had taken of the tires of Kerry's car, and they compared them to pictures of the tire tracks at Joey's cabin, and they determined they were a perfect match. So later that day, which was July 24th, police officers went back out and tracked Kerry down again. This time he was having lunch at one of his favorite spots. It was a nudist resort about 3 hours northwest of the Cedar Lodge. There he was arrested on the suspicion of murdering Joey Armstrong, and he was brought in for questioning. As soon as he was walked into the police station and was booked, Kerry dropped a bombshell. He confessed to not only murdering Joey Armstrong, but also he confessed to murdering Carol Sund, along with her daughter Julie Sund, and Sylvina Peloso, the friend of Julie Sund. And he did all of this on his own. He had no other accomplices, which means the police never had the killer or killers behind bars. It would turn out Eugene Dykes, who was one of their primary suspects, was lying when he made those self-incriminating remarks about he and his half-brother Michael. And as for those synthetic fibers that were found on Eugene and Michael, those fibers belonged to a very commonly sold blanket, and so they did not definitively tie Michael and Eugene to the crime. So for half a year in 1999, there really was a serial killer just roaming free in Yosemite National Park, just like many people who lived in that area and like some people in the media had speculated. Kerry would go on to give a very detailed and graphic 6-hour-long confession of how he went about killing all 4 women. This is his awful story. On February 14th, 1999, so the day that Carol, Julie, and Sylvina arrived at Cedar Lodge, Kerry was on his way to his girlfriend's house. His girlfriend, like Kerry, worked at the Cedar Lodge. She was a waitress at their 1950s-style diner. That night, as Kerry walked up her front walkway towards her front door, he made up his mind that he was going to act on a fantasy he had had since he was 7 years old. And that fantasy was to kill a young woman. And so his plan that night was he would go inside and he would not only kill his girlfriend, but he would also kill her 2 daughters who were 10 and 11 years old at the time. But when he went inside the house and was about to carry out this plan, he noticed out one of their windows there was a man in their backyard. And he asked his girlfriend, who's that guy out there? And she would say, oh, I hired someone to take care of our property. So he's going to be cutting the grass and, doing some things with our garden. He's going to be here for a little bit, but he'll stay outside. And so this totally screwed up Kerry's plan because he was not expecting there to be anybody there that night. And so for several hours, Kerry anxiously sat there constantly looking out the window, waiting for this guy to leave so he could kill these 3 people. But the worker was just taking a lot of time and it didn't seem like he was even close to being done. And so finally, Kerry left without any explanation. Angry and frustrated, he began driving back to Cedar Lodge, where he had an apartment on the second floor. And when he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed there was a car he had not seen earlier in the day. It was a 1999 red Pontiac Grand Prix. And suddenly, Carrie had this urge to find out who owned that car. And maybe, if he was lucky, it was a woman who owned that car, and she was potentially alone. And if that was the case, he could fulfill his fantasy on this woman and not worry about the fact that he couldn't kill his girlfriend and her 2 kids. And so Carrie parked his car a little bit away from this red car, and he walked over to the room that was right in front of this red car. And it was room 509, and he peeked behind one of the curtains into the room, which was all lit up, and he couldn't believe his luck. There were 3 women inside of this room. It was Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. And so Carrie stayed back and continued looking through the window just to make sure there wasn't a man inside of this room. And after a while of watching them go in and out of the bathroom and nobody coming into the room but these 3 women and no men coming into the room from the outside, he was certain they were alone. And so when Carrie finally turned around and left to go back to his room, he made the decision that he was going to come back the next day and kill them. The next day, which was February 15th, Carrie secretly followed the 3 women when they hopped in their rental and drove to Yosemite. He followed them to the parking lot, and then he waited in the parking lot until the women had finished going through the park and having this wonderful time. He trailed them from the parking lot back to the Cedar Lodge, and then he secretly followed them when they went to that diner and they had hamburgers for dinner. And he continued to follow them from a distance and watched them rent movies from the front desk. And he followed them all the way back to their room. And once he knew they were inside their room and he watched them long enough to confirm they were not going to leave again, he went back to his room and he got his toolbox. In his toolbox was rope, duct tape, a knife, and a gun. And then around 11 p.m., he left his apartment and went downstairs and walked all the way back over to that corner room, room 509, where the women were. And he looked in the window and it was totally dark inside, so he assumed they must be sleeping, and he knocked on the door. A few minutes later, Carol came to the door and very cautiously opened it up just a crack, leaving that chain link lock still attached. And so she looked through at Carrie and said, "Hi, can I help you?" And Carrie, who held up his handyman toolbox and pointed to his name tag that said he was the Cedar Lodge handyman, he said, "Hi, ma'am, sorry to disturb you so late, but there is a leak in the room right above yours, and I need to make sure the leak is not coming down into your room. So can I come in and just have a quick look, and then I'll be out of here?" And Carol apparently was just not buying it, and she said, "Look, I haven't seen any leaks in this room. I don't think there is one, but even if there is, can it please wait until tomorrow, because we're all trying to sleep." But Carrie was very persistent, and Carrie was known to be very charming and very disarming, and eventually he talked his way into the room. And so he walks inside, he walks past the bed where the other 2 teen girls are still sleeping, he goes into the bathroom, and for a few minutes he kind of pretends to fiddle around inside of the bathroom while Carol is standing right outside looking in at him. And then at some point, Carrie reached into his toolbox, pulled out the gun, and he aimed it at Carol, and he said, "Stay calm, I'm not going to hurt you, this is just a robbery." Carol most likely believed their best chance at getting out of this situation was just to comply and do what he says. He'll rob us and then he'll leave and we'll be okay. And so Carol very dutifully went back into the room and she quietly woke up her daughter and her daughter's friend, and before long Carrie had tied up all 3 of them. He put the 2 teenagers in the bathroom and shut the door, and then he put Carol on the bed. And then he proceeded to assault Carol before strangling her to death with more rope. And then after she was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel room and put her in the trunk of her own rental car. And then after he shut the trunk, he went back inside the motel room. He went to the bathroom, he opened it up, he grabbed Sylvina, who was crying, and pulled her out, and he left Julie alone, cowering inside the bathroom by herself. He shut the door behind her, and then he brought Sylvina over to the bed, where he assaulted her before strangling her as well to death with some additional rope. And then after Sylvina was dead, he carried her body outside of the motel and put her in the trunk of the rental car along with Carol's body. And then after that, he went back inside the motel room, and then once again he opened up the bathroom door, he grabbed Julie, pulled her out, and proceeded to assault her as well. But then afterwards, he did not strangle her to death. Instead, he walked her back into the bathroom and shut and locked the door. And while she was in there wondering what's going to happen to her, what happened to her mom, what happened to her friend, he proceeded to clean up the room and tidy it up, and he moved all of their luggage out of their room and put it into the rental car. And then after he was satisfied, he went back inside the motel room, he opened up the bathroom door, he pulled Julie out and had her stand right outside the bathroom, and then Carrie proceeded to clean up the bathroom but left a couple of wet towels on the ground to give the impression that the women woman had left in a bit of a hurry. And so after that, he grabbed Julie and he walked her out to the car and he sat her down in the front seat. She only had a blanket on at this point. Everything else had been taken off of her. And then Carrie hopped in the front seat and he began driving off. Julie must have been beyond terrified. She has no idea where her mom is. She has no idea where her friend is. She has no idea they're actually dead, locked in the trunk right behind her. And the man that had just assaulted her for hours is now driving her into the darkness. She has no idea where she's going, and all she's got is this blanket around her. It's just beyond brutal what's happening to this poor girl. And so for 2 hours, Carrie drove them west along the highway in the middle of the night, and the whole time he's trying to make small talk with this poor girl, trying to tell her that she's going to be okay and that her mom and her friend, they're going to be okay. And then finally he pulls off the highway down some switchbacks into this big parking lot of the Don Pedro Lake. And then once he parks the car, there's no other cars around. It's still dark out. The sun hasn't come up. He gets out and he tells Julie to get out of the car. But Julie is so scared, she can't move. So she can't even get out of the car. And so Carrie gets out. He walks around to her side. He opens the door and he scoops her up like you might hold a baby. And he walked with her up the trail all the way to this overlook that was well away from any prying eyes in the parking lot. And once he was out of sight, he took her blanket off and he laid it down, and then he proceeded to assault her again. And then as the sun began to come up over the lake, Carrie realized that he had to end his fantasy and begin to cover his tracks. And so Carrie stops what he's doing. He stands up, he reaches down and pulls Julie up to her feet. And so she's standing with her back to the lake. And as he's looking at her, he says, "I love you." And then he pulls out his knife and begins hacking her throat. And then he pushes her down the hillside where she tumbles and finally comes to a stop underneath some bushes where she dies. Carrie grabbed the blanket on the ground and he walked back to the rental car in the lot. There was nobody out there, so he hopped inside. He drove out of the lot and drove 1 hour north until he was well into this forest, and he pulled down a logging road where he abandoned this car. After he ditched it, he walked back up to the highway and caught a cab back to Cedar Lodge. He would come back to the car and torch it 2 days later. He would also make a special trip to Modesto, California, where he would drop Carol's wallet in the middle of the road near a high school in order to confuse investigators. A month later, when Carol and Sylvina's body were found in the back of the burned out car, Carrie would send that handwritten note to police that had the map of where Julie's body was and that horrible message of "we had fun with this one," referencing Julie. He sent that to police in order to further confuse them. He wanted them to believe that there really was more than one person perpetrating these murders, hence the "we had fun with this one." Months would go by, and the police, despite questioning Carrie along with the other Cedar Lodge staff members, never considered him a suspect. And that was because, one, they really thought he was just a nice, normal guy and couldn't be capable of committing violence against these 3 women. And two, probably most importantly, the police discovered when Carrie was a child, his younger brother was kidnapped by a pedophile and held for 7 years. And although his brother was ultimately returned to the family alive, that experience was incredibly traumatic and devastating to Carrie. And so the police figured there's no way this guy would ever abduct or harm other people because he knows how traumatic and awful that is for the victim and the victim's family. If anything, Carrie seemed like the type of guy who would go out of his way to protect and save these 3 women from being abducted or from being harmed. In July of that year, so 4 months after the 3 women's bodies were discovered, Carrie, who believed he had completely gotten away with murder, and to that point he really had, he was just driving around Yosemite kind of reveling in the fact that he had gotten to live out this fantasy and not get punished for it, when he noticed there was this woman way off in the distance walking in and out of this cabin that was fairly isolated. And so he drove his 1979 International Scout blue SUV down this forested road, and he reaches this meadow and he looks across this meadow, and now that this woman is even closer, he can tell she's clearly loading things into her truck, and she's going back and forth, and he's watching, wondering if there's anybody else helping her, because this cabin is very secluded, and he's thinking if she's alone, I might be able to kill her too. And so after a while, when he only sees her loading things into her white pickup truck, he decides he's gonna go kill her. And so he drives across the meadow and he pulls up right next to her truck and he gets out and he introduces himself. And the woman is so completely caught off guard by this random strange man showing up in the middle of the night, suddenly acting so friendly, that kind of reflexively, in an effort not to be rude, she says, "Hi, I'm Joey Armstrong. Nice to meet you. What are you doing down here?" And Carrie would proceed to spark up some small talk. He asked her if she believed in Bigfoot, and they kind of got on this tangent about Bigfoot. And then at some point, Carrie drew a pistol and he aimed it at her and said, "Go inside your cabin." And so Joey put her hands up and she went inside the cabin like she was told, and Carrie followed her inside, and then he bound her wrists and he bound her mouth with duct tape, and then he ordered her to get back inside of his SUV. And then once she was sitting inside the front passenger seat, Carrie got in the driver's seat and he began leaving the cabin, headed back out away towards that road he came in on. And as he's bombing across the meadow, Joey leaps head first out of the window of this moving car and smashes onto the ground, and she immediately jumps up and just starts running back towards the cabin. Carrie jams on the brakes, he hops out and he starts chasing after Joey, but Joey manages to get fairly close to that tree line right behind the cabin before Carrie ultimately grabs her and tackles her to the ground. And then Joey is viciously trying to fight Carrie off of her, and Carrie, kind of in a panic, draws his knife and he tries to slash at Joey, but Joey tucks her chin, protecting her neck from being stabbed. And so frustrated, Carrie just stands up and he grabs Joey by the hair and he begins hauling her towards the forest behind her cabin. And the whole time Joey's doing everything in her power to try to escape, but she just can't. And finally they get inside the woods and Carrie drags her into this ditch. And once she's down at the bottom, he puts his foot on the top of her head and forces it back, forcibly exposing her throat. And then at that point, he pulls out his knife and he begins to cut. Afterwards, Carrie considered keeping Joey's head, but ultimately he would try to hide it in some bushes nearby. After Carrie attempted to cover up some of the blood in the area with some branches and leaves, he left the forest and went back to his SUV. He didn't even attempt to tidy up the scene. He left her truck as is, he left her cabin as is. He just hopped in his SUV and drove back to Cedar Lodge. Carrie would tell police that as soon as he killed Joey Armstrong, all he wanted to do was go kill his girlfriend and her two young daughters, the 10 and 11-year-old. But police caught him before he could carry out the attack. Carrie Stainer, who never showed any remorse for his victims, was ultimately sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution in San Quentin Prison in Northern California. One of the more distressing aspects of this case was Carol's camera that was found intact near the burned out car in the woods. The police would develop the pictures on this camera in hopes there would be some clue as to who murdered them, but it would turn out there wasn't any usable evidence on the camera. It was just pictures of Carol, her daughter, and Sylvina having this wonderful time in Yosemite, and that was it. But after Carrie confessed to what he did to these poor women, those pictures take on a whole new, much darker meaning. In the final 8 images of the camera roll, we know Carrie Stainer was either literally watching these women secretly at the time the picture was taken, or he was patiently waiting nearby for them to return. The final image that was taken on this camera was taken by Julie of her mother sitting on the bed and her friend Sylvina sitting on the other bed as they're getting ready to turn out the lights and go to sleep. That picture was taken just moments before Carrie knocked